Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod to make a recurring or one-time contribution and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Happy Pride Month, all my LGBTQ listeners and my straight but not narrow pals. We'll get to the importance of Pride Month in just a second, but first, my news. It's pretty mundane this week. I got trips to Philadelphia and Silver Spring for work. I'm on a week-long running streak that is going to be tough to maintain in the week ahead because of the aforementioned travel. I finally finished my first read of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James on Sunday. I recorded another episode this weekend, which puts me an awesome 4 weeks ahead on the show, which feels pretty good. I had a really wonderful time with this weekend's guest, the artist Barbara Nessum, which makes me happy. You'll hear all about that one in the end of June. Like I said, kind of mundane this time around by my lights. So let's dive into this week's show. My guest this time around is Hugh Ryan, author of the wonderful new book, When Brooklyn Was Queer, A History. It's published by St. Martin's Press, and it's an amazing exploration of a century plus of queer life in Brooklyn, from the time of Walt Whitman up until the late 60s, just a few years before Stonewall would happen in Manhattan. And Hugh goes into exactly why he ends the story where he does. The book's fantastic. It's really an accessible, entertaining read. Hugh does a great job of bringing his sources to life and finding these amazing, amazing anecdotes, balancing quotes and exposition with really flowing prose without forcing contemporary frameworks on what was happening over the 19th and 20th centuries. So he frames these different historical moments in terms of how sexuality was understood, how immigration and the economics of Brooklyn and New York and the country affected queer life, and what some of the societal forces were that led to this particular scene's rise and fall. And since, as it turns out, no one's ever done a queer history of this borough before, Hugh came across a ton of amazing sources and scoops. Some stuff is kind of salacious but entertaining, like the story of the swastika swishery, which you'll have to read the book to find out. But he also goes into, in our conversation, a couple of other things that really open the eyes of other historians and biographers. So I can attest, you don't need to be queer to enjoy this book. It probably helps. But regardless, it's a joy to read. It is absolutely illuminating in terms of understanding the cultures and the subcultures that make up our lives and our communities, and how fragile and resilient they both can be. I was just awfully happy to get to sit down with Hugh to talk about the project, where it came from, what he learned in the process, and where he goes from here. Now, also, I want to thank Lance Richardson, who I recorded with last year around his absolutely wonderful book, House of Nutter, The Rebel Tailor of Savile Row. He's the guy who connected me with Hugh, and I love it when guests enjoy the experience of the podcast enough to suggest more guests, unless they're doing it in revenge or something. Anyway, I don't think that was the case with this one. As caveats go, we recorded in a conference room in an office, so the room was a little echoey. And since this was the second show of the day for me, my voice is a little bit shot. Now, here's a bio for Hugh. There's a longer one at his website, hughRyan.org. Hugh Ryan is a writer and curator based in Brooklyn. He is the founder of the Pop-Up Museum of Queer History and sits on the boards of QED, a journal in LGBTQ world-making, and the Museum of Transgender Herstory and Art. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Tin House, BuzzFeed, the LA Review of Books, Washington Post, Out, and many other venues. He is the author of When Brooklyn Was Queer, and is the recipient of the 2016-17 Martin Duberman Fellowship at the New York Public Library, a 2017 New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship in Nonfiction Literature, and a 2018 residency at the Watermill Center. Oh, something else I also found out through Instagram in a weird way. He is also a graduate of the Bennington MFA writing program. And some of you longtime listeners know that I've recorded with like half the faculty at Bennington in that MFA program over the years. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Hugh Ryan. Already in progress, where we were talking about some of the challenges of balancing gender and racial representation in When Brooklyn Was Queer. But you can fall into that cocoon. Yeah. And even within the book, I mean, you have to juggle male and female, queer, and I'm sure there's more documentation on one side versus another at different times, but you got to get that balance. Otherwise, you're exerting your privilege.
Yeah. And also, I mean, just as a historian, I will say, like, as soon as I started looking into it, I realized that if I wasn't doing that, it's like I come to these stories in part because I want to define myself, right? Like, which I think is like an embarrassing truth. But
we're recording right now.
Oh, are we? Okay.
I figure we may as well. This is a good place for us to
totally
to
great.
launch
Yeah. So you're looking for a mirror, or at least I was in part to see something that I had never seen. I mean, when I came out, I had never met an out gay person in my life. A couple cousins that we all knew, but it wasn't exactly openly discussed. So I think a lot of us come to it that way, but the longer that you do it, the more you realize that what is actually there is more of a window to seeing something that is totally different. And that's kind of the exciting part for me. But I understand coming to it, looking for something. Yeah,
well, in your case, with the book, you make a really good case of establishing the spectrum of sexuality, or the lack of one strike and you're out from the straight world. And in fact, that's in keeping with the militant black cartoonist I recorded with, who said, racism is white people's problem. Mm-hmm. It's white people's problem with things. In the same way, defining homosexuality is straight people's issue with making sure that's different than us, as opposed to, again, the era that you're largely covering where it's more fluid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, that's what I was going to say. So I understand that a lot of modern readers are going to come to my book wondering, where would I, in my subjective position, be in this history, and that I was either going to open doors for a lot of people and do the research for a lot of people to want to read this and see some of them, not, exactly themselves, or I was going to open the door for the same set of people who already had the door open, right? And I was like, I need to do this research because it is such a different experience for, a man versus a woman, a cis person versus a trans person, a white person versus a black person, particularly when you go back to the 19th century. I mean, through all of this history, but I mean, particularly in the Victorian era, it's just a different world. I think for all of us, really.
Where'd the book start for you? I know you talk about it in the afterword, but I figure for the listeners, where did it all begin?
In a place of pure and total ignorance.
As it should.
I found myself working. So years ago, when I moved back to New York after being away for a while, I was living in a big loft space in Brooklyn, and some folks were planning a week of events that were going to be queer events in queer people's houses on queer topics, and they wanted a place to kick it off. And they approached us, the folks living in this apartment, because we had a large space that hosted parties regularly. And my roommates, we were all in our 30s by that point and old, and said no. We just didn't feel like having 100 random strangers. And I said I was willing to take it on if they let me throw a museum instead of a party. And they were like, what is that? And I said I didn't know, but I wanted to figure this out. I was really interested in the idea of queer museology. And there had just been this hide-seek exhibit at the Smithsonian where David Warnerovich was removed after some conservative protests. And I love his work. And so it felt really important to kind of work this out. And we did this show in Brooklyn. Started an organization called the Pop-Up Museum of Queer History to kind of do it other places. And a few years into doing that, we returned to Brooklyn. And we kind of worked out what our modus operandi was, which is that we would go to places, do shows based in local history with local artists and community members, kind of act as support for them to put on a show about their own history, and then bring in pieces from the outside to bolster it. And so we're like, great, we'll do a show about Brooklyn's history. And then everyone in the room kind of looked at each other and was like, do you know anything about Brooklyn's queer history? And it turned out no one did, like not just us. We asked around, and the responses we got kind of fell into 3 categories. Walt Whitman, public sex in Prospect Park, and lesbians in Park Slope. That was about it. And most of that history was very recent, post-Stonewall. And I thought, well, either one of 2 things is happening here. Either there is history that has been hidden or just not recorded or passed on, or queer people are like vampires, we can't cross moving water, and we're all stuck in the village. Yeah. So I thought I'll research both these ideas.
Because you queers can be really strong. I'm just kidding. Go.
You never know. I don't like the sun very much. So, but no, so I started doing this research and I thought, well, there are specific conditions around Brooklyn. We did grow as a city next to Manhattan, and that could have changed the way that people sort of experience their sexuality or express their sexuality. Maybe there is very little history in Brooklyn itself. Maybe all the people came to Manhattan. I was willing to entertain that idea, but that's where I started, was just I need to figure out for myself, is there history here? And then if there is, what does it look like? Because it turned out that not only did I not know about Brooklyn's queer history, I didn't know about Brooklyn's history. And to understand the experience of queer people in Brooklyn, I needed to understand the experience of Brooklyn.
Yeah, and that's what one of the many things I found fascinating with the book was Brooklyn's overall history, the economics, I'd read The Power Broker, so I know the Robert Moses impact on all this stuff. But again, the way neighborhoods evolved, got destroyed, et cetera, and what role that plays in cultural dynamics like this, where people give up and go to Manhattan, or, you end up with lesbians in Park Slope decades and decades later. Given the marginalized population, or the fact that this is a population that didn't know it existed, what was the toughest part of research as you kept going back further?
The toughest part of research? Well, I would say probably the toughest part of my research, honestly, was finding the histories of queer people of color in Brooklyn. And there were several reasons for that. One, for most of the span that I was researching, and this was a shock when I discovered it, Brooklyn was never less than 98% white. For most, post the end of slavery in New York State up through the 1940s, Brooklyn is an incredibly white space. Whiter than Manhattan, more racist than Manhattan. And we know that because there are things like a vote in the late 1800s to allow what they were calling universal male voter rights. But really what they meant was allowing black men who didn't own property to actually vote in elections. And it failed statewide, but in Brooklyn it failed spectacularly. Like it garners maybe 20% of the vote, And so I found all of this evidence about that history, and that I could see how the racial dynamics played out, but finding the actual histories of people of color. So I knew that I had to hold both those things in balance, to sort of say to myself, why is this a white space and how is whiteness being constructed in this space? But also, where are the histories of people of color? And that often meant that I needed to look at, I would look through the archives of the New York Times and the Brooklyn Daily Eagle and sort of the major papers of the day. And then I would have to do a specific search looking through black newspaper archives. And it would be the same. I would go to a supposedly like general performance history archive, and then I would have to go to the black archive over and over again, particularly with the history of black people in the U.S. It was not kept as well at the time, was not passed down as well historically, and then you have an overwhelmingly white space like Brooklyn where there's just less history to find. So that really required me to have real eyes in the material and search really deeply.
Yeah, were there instances where I'm not sure if 2 anecdotes equals a trend, where you're stuck, again, the further back you go in time, trying to figure out, is this really a movement at any point, or is this just some isolated incidents that I happen to catch on to?
Yeah, one of the places that was really interesting was looking at, so in the late 19th century, drag is really big. Male impersonation, female impersonation, drag kings, drag queens. They wouldn't have used the word drag, but it's pretty analogous, so I'm kind of fine using it ahistorically. But drag kings and drag queens are both really big. And in the late 1900s and early 20th century, late 1800s, and early 20th century, there are a number of black drag kings in America who have fairly well-documented careers. And I wanted to look at those experiences because the history of sort of gender play performance is really important to queer history in general. In the late 19th century, that's where you first see a lot of queer people in public is on the stage. And I knew that that history was really important in Brooklyn because Coney Island and Brooklyn Heights both have these long histories of theaters. But what I couldn't find was information to say whether any of these particular performers, these black performers, may have been queer outside of working in drag. I knew from looking at a lot of the white performers, many were married and did not seem to have issues with their gender identities. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean they're sort of straight and cisgender, but it implies it. And I was able to do the research to find queer women working within drag, queer white women, pretty easily. There's a famous one named Ella Wesner, who I profile in the book. But finding a queer black woman who did drag, because that required access not to just to their performance life, but to their personal life. And that's what went unrecorded. And so I had to really search to find newspaper articles. And eventually I found that Florence Hines, who was perhaps the most famous black drag king of the time, there are some newspaper articles that strongly suggest that she was having relationships with other women in the shows that she was performing in. And so I was like, yes!
Yeah, how much did you have to infer? And, you know, knowing that, again, in some instances, the language simply wasn't there. And in other instances, it was, you know, the typical, you know, oh, his longtime friend, you know, that sort of.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was a lot of that, particularly in obituaries. You find yourself wading through these intimate friendships. And you're like, what does intimate mean there?
Yeah.
You know, so that was difficult. There were definitely some places where I had to infer from the language or from the way things were spoken about. For instance, there were two women, particularly in the Victorian era, this is true, because you have this level of homosociality, so people are expected to spend a lot of time, men with other men, women with other women. They're expected to be effusive about how they feel and to record these really intense emotions, and so you get these really powerful testaments to love. And at first I started to ask myself, well, what does this mean? Is there a genital component? You know, is this homosexual? And then I started to back away from that because I was like, you know what? That's actually taking the wrong tact on this. This is trying to force my modern conceptions of sexuality on these people for whom that may not have mattered all that much. And what I started to see was, for instance, you can look at a relationship between two individuals and say, this relationship was of primary importance in their life. It had physical as well as emotional components, many of which seem erotic, if not necessarily sexual. You know, people writing letters about touching one another and sleeping in the same bed and anointing each other in oils. Those are erotic experiences, even if they're not sexual, even if they're not thought of as homosexual. And as these experiences go on in the end of the 19th century, I started to see the people involved in them starting to worry about how they're going to be interpreted. This doesn't necessarily mean anything about what they were doing or how they would fit into our modern conceptions, but it said to me that their relationships were queer. In a sense. Yeah. They're not exactly what they're supposed to be. They have erotic and physical dimensions, and they're between people of the same sex. And so I kind of backed away from worrying too much about interpretation. Where I did worry about that was often in the case of like legal arrests and things like that. Like, what does sodomy mean in 1867?
Did you get the Naomi Wolf story yesterday?
Oh, my perpetual nightmare. I mean, I feel so bad for her.
You know, that doesn't mean what it actually means in your book.
Yeah. And that's funny. You know, sodomy did historically in the U.S. really refer to sexual assault. It was a way of prosecuting violence, not consensual sex, but violence that didn't rise to the level of a penile vaginal assault. It was between two men, or between a man and an animal, or a man and a woman, but didn't, you know, anyway. And so we're reading about what happened to her. It was just an absolute, you know, terror.
Listening to the audio first and then reading it, that was the... Yeah.
But I see that mistake getting made all over the place in many different ways. A few years ago, someone sent me an article that was actually very interesting about the history of sex laws in, I believe it was Portland. And it was fascinating, but it made the case that this sodomy law that gets written that writes into it exactly what sexual practices they're talking about, oral sex and anal sex, they were saying is important because it doesn't refer to particularly just gay sex, you know? And I was like, that is important, but what's actually more important in terms of the 19th century is that it writes out violence. It's setting the stage for where we are going, but that's invisible to us today because we don't think of sodomy as having a necessarily violent component.
Sure. Yeah, how much of you mentioned already having to filter out modern sensibility in the process. How alien was it for you? the deeper you went in. Yeah.
Particularly the 19th century. I mean, you just have to wrap your head around a world that is constructed very differently. I don't think that homosexuality as we know it and think about it today would have emerged in our consciousness the way it did if it wasn't against a background of this world of homosexuality and men's sphere and women's spheres collapsing, right? It's only that we're problematizing relationships between men and relationships between women that makes homosexuality stand out kind of the way it does. So I had to put myself in that mindset and to question myself over and over again because, I am a bit of a gay supremacist and I will say, no, that person is definitely queer.
It would die out within a generation.
No, that's what lesbian scientists will handle all of that.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
But I did have this, real desire. I would see people who, for whatever reason, something in their bio spoke to me. And I would have to say to myself, okay, what part of this is looking for confirmation that is useful to the book? What part of this doesn't need confirmation because their life is queer, regardless of whether I can find out whether they had, sexual contact with another man? And what part of this is me trying to impose categories from today onto people where it doesn't matter that much, And that was hard. I had to pull back and oftentimes let go of talking about certain people in certain ways because I was like, I cannot substantiate this from the record. This is just my desire.
Craziest story you wish you could have included?
Craziest story I wish I could have included. Okay, well, this is one that I actually only learned a little bit later than the book, so I'm
also going to ask about that. What things have come up subsequently?
Someone said to me, he was like, look, my first boyfriend when I moved to New York grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community right off of Coney Island. And his favorite story was that as a kid in the 1930s, he would go to the beach to collect, dropped change as a way of making money during the Depression. But what he would do is he would collect the change all day. And then he would sneak into the bars that sold, those claw games where you can win toys? Yeah. It was one of those, but they were selling what were called French postcards or porn. And so he would go in and he would win. He would play until he won some of those French postcards. And then when the sun set, he would sneak underneath the boardwalk and he would trade the postcards to sailors for hand jobs.
Okay.
At the age of 10. And I was like, okay, that's a story that no one has told me and is not recorded in the archive anywhere at all. I cannot include it, but it is fascinating.
Well, you figure that's either the accompanying website or, when you get the paperback edition. There are many things I've heard subsequently that...
There is one story that I almost included, and ultimately I decided not to. Now I kind of go back on it. But before Walt Whitman, there were these two guys who called themselves the Brothers Graham. And they weren't brothers. They were two men who met. One of them was already married and had children by this point. The other one was single. I believe they're both immigrants to the country. They changed their last name. They spend the next 20 years together. They become really important in terms of, I think it's shipping. They become sort of business magnates in Brooklyn before it's really, as it's becoming a city, in the 1830s. And they're really interesting. They stay together for a really long time. Eventually, one of them gets married to a woman and has kids. The other one seems to maybe have a relationship with another man. I haven't dug too deeply into their archive. They're fascinating as individuals. But the reason I decided to start with Walt Whitman is that he very consciously is thinking about himself in relationship to other people and in relationship to what we would today call a sexual identity in ways that I couldn't find proof of other people doing in Brooklyn really before him. He's making words about this experience. What is the word for a man who loves another man? What is the word for that love? What is the symbol they should exchange with one another? Which I think shows that he is trying to reach a community. So that means by that point there is a community to be reached. The Brothers Graham are fascinating, but they're sort of two individuals, just individual plots of data that don't lead me into a bigger story or the idea of a bigger queer community in Brooklyn. So I think if there a revised edition does happen, I probably will want to try and find a way to include that story. But when I was thinking about this, they were so esoteric. I wanted to start with something people knew. Walt Whitman is such a great intro to that. And he also sort of claims Brooklyn in a way. He
epitomizes the whole shebang.
Yeah. So if there's ever a way I can work the Brothers Graham in, I'd like to. But
fake history, pretend they were running some sort of brothel that there's no records of this, but I kid. What did surprise you the most?
Surprised me the most. Well, the popularity of drag, as I mentioned, in the end of the Victorian era, completely shocking to me. The whiteness of Brooklyn really totally shocking.
I'm sure you were just thinking Staten Island.
The prevalence of bathhouses. I mean, it shouldn't have shocked me. I know about tenements, and I knew that tenement apartments didn't have a lot of toilet facilities. But seeing that there were 30 bathhouses, giant bath complexes active at the same time on Coney Island with these incredibly intense sort of rivalries and communities that built up around them, that some of them obviously had queer history going back into the 1920s. That just wasn't something I expected to see. And that's actually what gave me the title for the book in a weird way. I had expected to see a lot of queer history, that I would find a lot of information. What I hadn't expected was to find that there was a period during which there were parts of Brooklyn in the 1920s and 30s, Coney Island, Brooklyn Heights, and the street known as Sand Street, which kind of leads from Brooklyn Heights, downtown Brooklyn, to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. That these areas were known by other New Yorkers as queer places where you would go to have queer experiences. If you wanted to go to a bar and pick up sailors, you would go to Sand Street. And that there was this time where parts of Brooklyn were acknowledged as queer neighborhoods the way we might talk about Chelsea or Harlem or Greenwich Village shocked me, because that was not anything I had ever learned about Brooklyn or about the queer history of New York, which I thought I knew so much about.
Mm-hmm. And it leads you to what I think is the single greatest scene in the entire book, the 1929 male beauty pageant.
I love that story.
Yeah, I think you seem to have a particular affection for it, the way you kind of, really, really dive into detail.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of...
that's a real point of frustration, though, because so the story is that there's this 1929 bathhouse decides they're going to have an all-male beauty pageant. And clearly, as soon as it starts, they realize they're off to the wrong foot. They didn't realize their bathhouse was full of gays, and everyone who shows up, there's something like 45 men who show up for the pageant, and they're in drag or wearing makeup, and they're camping it up, and they clearly feel comfortable in a way that suggests this settled community. And the judges, who are like these famous, a Broadway actor, Rudy Vallee's sister, they freak out over this. They're screaming about the sanctity of the family and calling the men floozies, which I think is hysterical. But the part that so frustrated me is that they mention repeatedly in this one article that was written for Variety magazine about it, that there was a photographer there and that the men camped it up for the camera. And I've never been able to find those photos.
Which I was wondering, what's the thing throughout the book that you wish to God you had? That's really
That's one of the biggest ones. Yeah. That and Hart Crane's mother burned all of his letters with all of these sailors. And Hart Crane obviously is not going to be forgotten. It wasn't that I was sad to lose this archive of Hart Crane's history, but that these sailors who in the particularly 19-teens, 1920s, who are often described as unlettered or poorly educated, these were letters where they expressed their love, their desires, their own understandings of what was happening between them and Hart Crane, and that's just not an archive that exists anywhere. Yeah. And I so wanted that material. Everyone burns their letters at some point, is what I discovered. If you're gay and you're looking historically, it's funny so depressing.
The beauty pageant reminded me of, and this is probably before your time because I'm an old wreck. It wasn't a wine cooler. It was some bottled drink called Cabana Boy that the marketer thought was going to appeal to middle-aged women who wanted to, and just didn't realize what was going to happen. It became the gay drink for like a year before they finally realized, we just need to stop marketing this. This is just like being taken in every wrong context for us. And look it up. That could be your oddball next, piece, the weird history of gay marketing.
I actually just saw something that was the exact opposite of that. I was just in Glasgow. And one night I was up with my partners. We were walking out 6:30 at night, and there is this bar that is like banging. I mean, like music pounding out of it, people coming in and out. We're like, okay, we'll check this out. It's clearly a gay bar. It's called like Merchant Pride, I think was the name of it. And it's a Sunday night, 6:30 in Glasgow. And we go inside, and the entertainers were a couple who apparently had had some big radio hits in the late 70s or early 80s, and now did a Sunday night set at this gay bar. And it was wall-to-wall women over 60 dressed up to go out, like just partying. Like you could tell that the bar had thought they were getting kind of a campy act that would bring in sort of a gay, kitschy crowd. Yeah. And maybe some of these women were gay, but they did not. It seemed mostly like straight women who'd had an amazing time in gay bars in the late 70s and early 80s and were there to like relive it was the best bar I've been to in decades.
Hag night?
It was amazing.
I don't know if
These
that term's
women
terrible to
were
use.
just the best, and I wanted to stay and party with them. They were so much fun. It was like all of them, me and my partners, and like a drag queen, and that was it. It was great.
Now, how's the reception been for the book so far? It's been out a couple of months?
Couple months, yeah. March 5th we came out.
You make me feel like a heel for not recording with you earlier. But
that was my fault. I pushed this off, so
Yeah.
please, entirely on me. But the reception has been great. I mean, people have been really, truly wonderful. You know, when we were first trying to sell the book a couple of years ago, we couldn't even get anyone interested. We had one editor, one out of every editor that we brought it to who made an offer. And even there were worries that it would be too local. The people weren't interested in Brooklyn. They weren't interested in queer history. And so to see that it's gotten such a great response, and in particular that there have been people who have emailed me and said, you know, I didn't think that there was any history. You know, I didn't think I had a history. And to hear those stories has been really touching. And I love that every reading I do, there is at least one person from Brooklyn or who spent a lot of time in Brooklyn at some point in their life who wants to get up and share a story and tell me something about the 70s in Brooklyn or lesbian life in Park Slope in the 80s. And I love it. That is just the most touching part of this, because so much of my book is so much older that I never really talk to a lot of living people.
Yeah.
And you get just a particular sense of joy and emotion when you talk to the people who actually lived it, as opposed to reading a transcript or an interview with them.
Yeah, have any older resources come up? I don't mean, again, 70s and 80s, but, you know, more historical resources. Have people had I didn't realize you were researching this. I happen to have, you know, my grandfather's letters to the man he was with in the Navy or something.
Yes, actually, this is a fantastic story. About a week before the book came out, I shared a video on Facebook. One of the people that I document is a woman named Madame Tirza, who was a burlesque dancer at Coney Island and around the country in the late 40s and early 50s. And she gets forced out in, I think, 53. They refuse to give her a license, and Robert Moses is shutting down Coney Island, and it's becoming dirtier and cheaper and more dangerous. And so she leaves in 53. But I was able to track her through interviews with other people. One of her dancers gave an interview much later in life and said that Madame Tirza was bisexual. And then I found an oral history with a woman who worked as a drag king in the 50s, and she said, I met my girlfriend when she was dancing in Madame Tirza's show down at Coney Island. And so I could tell that she was this important figure, but like a lot of burlesque performers, she changed her name frequently. She moved around all the time, trying to establish much information beyond life at Coney Island was very hard. And so there was this video made right before she left Coney Island, 1953. Coney Island was on the skids. Robert Moses is really attacking it and shutting it down. And the city is suburbanizing. And so these places where, 3 million New Yorkers would gather all at once are becoming to be seen as tawdry and gross, and Coney Island is losing its luster. So they make this video to try and get people to go to Coney Island. I think it's called Coney Island, USA. And it is a weird, freaky video. Like their video of Madame Tirza dancing. She's in her wine fountain, which she built herself because she was a licensed plumber as well as a long-haul trucker. And she is dancing.
I'm bisexual, you say. I find that hard to believe.
Yeah, I know, right? There's some great photos of her like plumbing where she looks like a Rosie the Riveter stripper. I mean, she's amazing. She's just an amazing woman. Yeah. But she's dancing in this video, and then the video keeps cutting to shots of like scary puppets laughing. It's very weird. And interestingly, the video voiceover, it's only like 50 seconds, makes a point of saying, women are allowed in Madame Tirza's show, but I just don't want you women to go in and be shocked and demand a refund. And so clearly there is something about her show and women and gender. Like I saw a lot of pieces of evidence around her show, but I couldn't find out a lot about her. So I share this video, and out of nowhere, a woman from, I think, Arizona reaches out to me, and I don't know anything about this woman. She says, "Where did you find that video?" And I explain, that I was doing this research and the book was coming out. And she says to me, "That's my grandmother." And I was like, oh my God. And, you're on Facebook, you don't know a lot about another person. And I just didn't know what her take on this was going to be, what the information I was sharing, was she going to be angry? And so I was really nervous about what should I do in this situation. But I had said to myself in doing my research from the very beginning that what was important to me was getting these stories out there in whatever format that took. And that if anyone asked me about any of my research, I was going to just open it up and give it to them, because that's what people had done to me. And that's what made this book possible. And so I said to her, it's amazing to meet you. Here is all the research I have on your grandmother. I'm happy to talk to you if there's anything, and she reached back out and said, thank you so much. I've been estranged from that side of family for most of my life. My mother didn't want us associating with them. Here's all the information I have. And she was able to give me Madame Tierce's birth date, her death date, the 9 different names she performed under, information about her mother, who was also a chorus girl in the Siegfried Follies, and just a ton of stuff that I didn't have and wouldn't have been able to find out any other way. And it was so exciting. And to get that information, I can already see how it will totally improve the revised version of the book.
Which, again, we'll push for. What's your history background?
It's remarkably thin.
And what did you have to learn in the process of, learning how to do this?
The useful thing is that my undergraduate degree was in women's studies. I went to Cornell in the 90s, and it was not where I started, but I realized while I was there that I wanted to understand cultural power, for lack of a better word, how these dynamics and forces work through us, which is a historical idea, but I wasn't doing it in a history department. And so I had some background in theory around history and definitely a lot around historical sexualities, Michel Foucault and Oscar Wilde and all of these, sort of major figures in the Western queer studies canon. But I didn't study history in particular. My master's is actually in creative nonfiction, and I came to it with a lot of experience in journalism and curating historical shows, but not in writing history in the same way. And so again, one of the biggest things I had to learn was the history around my subject. And to learn even to think to do that was one of the hardest steps, that I would go and I would research, some gay moment in the 1870s. And then I would get back to my apartment and I'd be like, wait, I didn't think to ask myself, what was the building that happened in? And what did it look like? And what was the weather like? And how did you get from one part of Brooklyn to another in 1870? And how long did that take? And why? And so those kind of questions multiplied upon themselves. Every time I would sit down and think that I knew what I was talking about, I would realize that there was just so much more about the 19th century that I needed to understand, or how laws got passed in the 1920s. That stuff was what I was really missing. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, in some ways what took the longest to figure out, because then that information, once I was able to figure out, okay, how did shipping change over 100 years in Brooklyn? And then I could take the information I had about queer people and queer experiences and put those on a timeline with one another and say to myself, oh, look, while this is changing over here, this is changing here. How could those be connected? And maybe they're not. But I had to figure out all of that urban history and 19th century history and Victorian history and New York City history. That was where I was really missing stuff.
Was reading The Power Broker the biggest time eater of your entire process, or not? It's
funny, by far and away the biggest time suck, although it was wonderful, was going through these archives where I just didn't know what I was finding. When you're going through an archive for Walt Whitman, obviously everything is useful. But often I was going through the municipal New York City archives for 1927, just being anything gay? Anything? Let's just read through hundreds of pages. I was lucky. I had an incredible assistant, a guy named Brian Furry, who's a queer historian. He was so dedicated, and I think, and I will say this for anyone trying to do historical work where you are coming at it from a place where you don't know very much, having someone to bounce ideas off of who is also in the thick of it makes a real difference. Having people to talk to about this stuff and having someone to debate ideas with and sort of take the pieces of evidence and rearrange them and say, what does the picture look like if we move this all around? Is there a different way to interpret what we're seeing here?
And the writing itself?
The writing stuff was the most fun part. I mean, that's where I love, once I have the research, I often joke I can't write fiction because I have no imagination whatsoever. Everything has to have happened for me to write about it. But once I have all of that, I was super lucky. I got a residency at the Watermill Center on Long Island for 1 month, and it came at the perfect place. I had just written the first couple chapters, and I had all of the research assembled for the basically second half of the book, but hadn't sat down to write it. And they put me up in a little house, and I had a studio by myself inside the Watermill Center, and it was 12 and 14-hour days of just writing nonstop. I wrote so hard, I broke my wrist. I eventually had to go to a doctor because it was hurting all the time, and she said that I'd given myself a stress fracture from typing too much. but it was glorious. I loved it.
See, again, if you get an assistant, you dictate to them, and eventually they take over, and you just put your name on it at the end.
I definitely need to be alone when I'm writing because I'm a mess. I'm talking to myself. I read everything out loud thousands of times, over and over again. I'll read the same sentence, trying to figure out why it's not working, what is wrong with it, or I'll write 2 paragraphs, and then I'll go back and I'll read those 2 paragraphs all the way through and add 1 sentence, and then I'll go back to the top and read all the way through. And so it was good to be alone where people wouldn't think I was totally crazy.
Do you think of writing in terms of spoken word?
Yeah.
Or the written page?
Or
is there always a performative thing when you're doing it aloud?
It's definitely both, but the final step for me is always reading it aloud. I have to hear it and feel it in my mouth, often because I think it helps me understand how someone saying it out loud gives me a little bit of insight, I feel, into how someone who's reading it for the first time is going to read it, how the sentence is going to break, and how certain phrases might feel weird or not convey what I want them to convey, or places where you might stumble. And because so much of the history I'm writing about is unknown to people, it felt really important to me that the reading experience be not just easy, but draw you in. I needed to pull people along.
And you had an education in that jargon-filled theoretical world that ultimately eats its own tail.
And made me want to go crazy. That's the reason I didn't end up doing grad school in that.
I went to Hampshire College in the late 80s and early 90s, so I know how pervasive and I've completely, self-isolating that sort of stuff can be. So to me, it's one of the great aspects of this. I had the slight trepidation, is it going to be theoretical? No, it's not theory at all. This is about actual people and how they lived and what they said to each other. And,
I think having those years of theory helped me to understand what I was seeing, but having 20 years away from theory was actually even more helpful.
Now, who were your writing influences? Were there either history or just creative nonfiction, people you idolize, emulate, and pray to God actually read the book and say, well, I really liked...
Oh my God. It's funny. I would say that the majority of my reading, particularly the last 4 or 5 years while I was working on this book, have been really dense academic texts, things that I'm not necessarily looking to for the kind of writing. They're doing a very different project where they're trying to really encyclopedically lay out all of the examples of a certain experience, or they're really theoretical and they're trying to lay out like what I often think of as a schematic for how life happens. It's not exactly how life happens, but it gives you the clear line drawing. And there were many of those, that are just so helpful to me as a thinker. LaShawn Harris is someone who really thinks deeply about gender, race, and urban life. And so that was just, so useful. And George Chauncey, he's very readable, but also just an incredible historian. His Gay New York, was just, I returned to it over and over and over again. But then when I was thinking more about style, I started to approach other historians like Joan Nessel, who writes really impassioned history, that it's very personal and it has a real flavor to it. You feel her in the text in a way that was important to me. And then there are all of these books that I would read that are totally not related to my subject.
I do wonder about those. Yeah.
That I would... I love young adult literature for the quality of pulling you in, that you cannot put it down, the readability. So Jandy Nelson, who wrote this book called I'll Give You the Sun, incredible book. It is nothing like my book whatsoever. But the way that I couldn't put it down, and every sentence flows, and there was never a moment where it got stilted or stepped out of its own voice. I think often that can happen in histories where you're quoting a lot of things. Yeah. You kind of are melding all of these voices together, and it can be jarring for the reader. And so that I would look to those kind of texts to kind of think about flow and the quality of the writing in that sense. And then, people who write kind of historical fiction, I love Sarah Waters, I'll always read her. But all kinds of authors, I think, really contributed to how the book actually ended up being. I think in terms of really closely, though, when I was thinking okay, what do I want this book to experience reading? Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow was really important. The Dark End of the Street by... oh God, I'm going to forget her name. It's an incredible professor or historian, and it's about women and sexual assault and violence in the civil rights movement. It was really an incredible and very useful book for me. I discovered there are not a lot of queer histories for a popular audience that aren't about a specific, a biography of so-and-so.
Yeah.
And so that's actually become now like a real interest of mine, like searching those out. If you have any recommendations, if you come across any, I'm always looking for more.
No. To me, most gays I know are just secretly trying to subvert and convert all the straight men. I'm just kidding.
It's not so secret. I mean, that's an active pursuit, I'd say.
But yeah, I'm trying to think of any queer author I've recorded with who had a book on this, but it's usually, again, biography of someone.
Yeah, it's biography or it's fiction. And it's great. Thank God for all of that. But it's been interesting to me to realize that someone asked me when the book came out in an interview to name 5 or 6 other recent.
Yeah, I was going to say, what were you pitching it as?
Yeah,
well, this
I was like, I don't have anything to pitch with.
Oh, man.
Although there are ones coming out right now. I just read a book that's coming out in the UK this week by Amelia Abraham called Queer Intentions, A Personal Journey Through GLBTQ Culture. And it is a very readable, it's not exactly history in the same way, but it does go into history and it goes into theory and it goes into the present sort of cultural moment. And clearly she has a lot of historical and theoretical background, but the book itself is just really super readable. And very much a personal investigation. Queer City, the book, the queer history of London, I think is really interesting. The end kind of falls apart a little bit for me, but it's this really mythopoetical kind of telling of the history. It's clearly very researched and very fact-based, but the telling of it just speeds you through hundreds of years in this really beautiful voice, which is not at all what I wrote in, but it's kind of another one when I think about queer popular history that kind of comes to mind right now. But I'm always looking for more. Not Straight, Not White was another really good one. Kevin Mumford, is that his last name? His book Interzones, which is an earlier work of his about black and white sex districts in Chicago and New York, was super helpful in terms of writing the book. And then this more recent one was not, I didn't use it for this book, but was really, really good.
And choosing to end it in the era that you did?
The book ends with the closing of the Brooklyn Navy Yard in the 1966, which is a couple years before the Stonewall Rebellion. And there were a few reasons for that, but the biggest one was just that I had found a very unique story, a particular story of these waterfront communities. And while it obviously is not the story of all queer people historically in Brooklyn, it did tell a very unified, easy-to-follow story, that these communities were built up by the waterfront economy, and when it fell down, they fell down with it. And so I just traced that, and the closing of the Navy Yard was really this kind of nail in the coffin last moment for a lot of the communities that I had been tracing. And I didn't want to write what I think of as an encyclopedia homosexualis, just to hear a whole bunch of gays in history. I wanted to
That's
have a
what
thesis.
I wondered. If you had kept going, do you run into the 70s, 80s proliferation of gay culture in certain areas of Brooklyn, and then it becomes exactly what you're saying, just too baggy and...
Yeah, that there were all these, I'm tracing one arc, and it's really, that arc is really tight, But after this point, the world has changed, and I think you see a number of queer threads that could become their own books or their own communities that are functioning under really, obviously they're connected by the same, effects. Things that are happening in Brooklyn are close, affecting all of them, but they're very disparate from one another. So the community that springs up in Crown Heights that you can sort of date back to the Starlight Lounge opening, and the community that starts in Park Slope in the late 70s or early 80s. I met a woman at one of my readings who said, I've been told I was the first lesbian in Park Slope. So that was very exciting. I definitely want to talk to her. But so that community has a very different story, and they don't have the kind of connection that these waterfront communities over this course of time had. So in that sense, it felt very natural that I saw this arc and I traced it, and it was just, that's where it ended, so that's where I was going to end. I had originally thought that I was going to be covering, lesbians in Park Slope because there's such a well-known history. But when I saw that what I was writing didn't go there, it felt like I was going to start shoehorning things in, and then it was going to get really awkward. And then there was something really kind of beautiful about ending right before Stonewall. Because one of the things that I think... this is hard to prove exactly, but when these queer communities that were in Brooklyn start to fall apart, one of the things that happened is all the mixed spaces where queer people and straight people were kind of socializing, or predominantly queer people, but they're not called like a gay bar the way they would be today. These spaces all close up. And at the same time that's happening in Brooklyn and all around New York City, you get really early gay bars, as we would think of them, opening in the village. So these communities start to sort of fall apart a little bit in the 1930s. By that point, there already are some gay bars in Greenwich Village, but more and more of them open as these other communities close down. And so what I realized is that we often think about this fluorescence of gay culture that happens after World War II, and it does, and it's absolutely real. But part of the story that doesn't get talked about is that all of these other places, these nameless, sort of less formed places that are less identitarian, are shutting down, and those people have nowhere to go, and they're getting forced into smaller and smaller spaces, both in terms of neighborhoods, right? So they're now just in Greenwich Village and maybe a little bit in Harlem and, a little bit still in Brooklyn Heights, but less so. And also smaller venues. The bars are becoming the only place to go, and they're only for gay people, and they're run by the mob, and they're dirty, and they're small. And so it sets the conditions, the stages for Stonewall, right? You have this people who are getting more and more oppressed, shoved into smaller and smaller spaces, and eventually that's going to explode. And I kind of like that I end my story with that ending, coming down in Brooklyn, knowing, because it's where I start the story, that Stonewall is going to happen in just a few years. And so it all suggests some of the origins of the history that we're more familiar with. But that was accidental. It really was just, this is when the waterfront history really comes to an end.
But it makes sense. Favorite era besides the current one, because this is the safest era to be gay in Brooklyn for you, and any earlier one, you'd run certain risks. But
certainly, although, a lot of the research I've shown has said before World War II, the homophobia was not what we think of it as. We think of this like 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s homophobia where you get beaten on the street. And mostly it's less, just as there's less awareness of homosexuality, or there's less awareness of homophobia. There just wasn't that same. Anyway, not important. My favorite era would definitely be the 1920s.
Yeah.
I think that in general, the 1920s were an amazing time. It's post-World War I. America wants to celebrate. Everyone thinks it's the end of the war to end all wars. It's a little frantic. It's a little crazy. You've got the subways open. You've got Coney Island is this huge mecca. Everything is changing and exciting, and everyone is embracing the future, and the economy is going up, and there's all this experimentation in literature and art. And queer life, particularly in Brooklyn, is manifold. It's happening all over the place. And there aren't gay bars, like I said. And in fact, there aren't a lot of people necessarily who think of themselves as gay as we would think of it today. But they're starting to. That's definitely lesbian, starting to. Even transgender a little bit. Trans people existed, but the conceptions are changing. This is the moment when conceptions are changing. And it's just such a fun life. I mean, it's people talking about... there's this woman, Mabel Hampton, who's a black lesbian dancer who's had all of these oral histories done with her because she's involved in the founding of the Lesbian History Archives. And she gets a job at Coney Island in 1920. And she describes life in the 20s by saying you'd go out, you'd have a ball, you'd sleep somewhere, and then go out the next night and have another ball. She says, I had so many girlfriends in the 20s, it wasn't even funny. It's this like expansive life that I... dream about. Plus, there's great design happening at the time. Everything looks really beautiful. So,
what's next? I know it's early and you're still promoting this, but,
Well, fingers crossed, actually. The next book kind of comes in a weird way directly from this. One of the things I realized in doing the research for this book is how intimately connected queer history is with the history of prisons and policing in America. Many of my records that I looked at come from people who are either the police themselves or people involved with the police or the court systems. They're doctors who are getting the people that they're studying from prisons or from courts. And so I realized, I'd always known connections between queer people in prisons. I mean, mostly which get expressed through really uncomfortable, awful jokes. But the jokes are pointing to something real, right? That there is a connection there. And there's one prison in particular that I became fascinated with called the Women's House of Detention, which used to be in Greenwich Village. It was built, I think they broke ground in 1929. They tore it down in 1974. It's now a garden. But for those 40 years, it really marked a space, the only space from all the records I can find and all the people I've talked to, where queer women saw other queer women on the street regularly, particularly in that time period, which is the most homophobic in American history, where there's no other space where you would see visible queer women assembled on the street every single day, day in and day out. And I thought, we never talk about that in connection with the history of Greenwich Village as queer space. And yet, that is an institution. And there are people coming in and out of it. And so then I started to research it, and I found as far back as the 1930s, people are writing about how it's giving the neighborhood a gay vibe, right? And they're complaining about it, and they know about it. And then I started to research the stories of the women who were kept inside there and what their lives were like, and how many of them were in prison for dressing the wrong way or
wearing pants. Yeah,
wearing pants. Or, even up to the late 1960s, early 70s, being sent there by their parents after they came out as gay. Their parents would call the cops on them and send them to prison to scare them straight, right? And I thought, this is an institution that carried on this sort of like public presence of queerness at the time when it was almost impossible to do so, that has touched the lives of more queer women than almost any other government institution that we have. Today, the Williams Institute estimates that lesbian, gay, bisexual people make up somewhere between 3 and 5% of the population. We can quibble with that, but that's their estimate.
Gay supremacist.
Yes. But using their rubric, that's the number they came up with. They looked at using the same rubric, they looked at people who have been imprisoned. And they found that 33% of women in jails, and I think 40% of women in prisons, were somewhere on the queer spectrum. That is a phenomenal number. And now imagine that back in time when you could be arrested for being at a bar by yourself, for wearing pants, for same-sex sexual activity. The numbers skyrocket. And we see this in the research. Angela Davis writes about homosexuality at the Women's House of Detention. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn writes about it. Florrie Fisher writes about it. The early gay liberation movement that emerges in the Village, the Women's House of Detention is one of the central spaces they're protesting against. Afeni Shakur, the mother of Tupac, she's actually in prison as part of the Panther 21 while pregnant with Tupac, while Stonewall happens. And during Stonewall, the women in the House of Detention could see down Christopher Street. They could see the riot. Wow. They tore up their possessions and they set them on fire, throwing them out the window, screaming, "Gay power, gay power." And Afeni Shakur later wrote that was the moment where she realized that gay people are oppressed and started to connect with the gay women in the prison with her. And a year later, she goes to the Black Panther Party's Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and she meets with the gay male workshop that's happening there. And she says to them, "I'm going to help you formulate your demands, that Huey P. Newton's statement on gay rights and women's rights is going to be a foundational document for the Black Power movement moving forward," and that she can see these connections. And the gay liberationists, in fact, the very Gay Liberation Front was founded to protest the Black Panthers being in that prison. You can see these connections. I just think the space is so important and so under-recognized in history. So I'm obsessed with it.
I can tell.
Now, try to sell a book about a women's prison. You think people think gay Brooklyn is a niche history?
You got the Orange is the New Black girl, but, when I watched that show for the first couple seasons, it really seemed like the Trojan horse of, we'll get some pretty white people, but really, it's about the women of color in the plays, but we have to make some sort of point of entree for, white suburban viewers.
Yeah.
Which, again, you seem to be pretty good at in terms of making this book accessible. So I wouldn't put it past you to pull off the next
I will say, along with being a queer supremacist, not only does that mean that I think everyone is queer or should be queer, but I think that my work should be read by everyone.
Well, yeah.
And so part of my job often is what is the inroad? How can I get people who aren't already in the space with me? What's the door I can open where I don't feel I've compromised myself, but rather that I've established a mutual point where we can both walk in together?
Either Tupac or pretend it's another sort of Black Panther tie-in and get all the Marvel crowd.
Well, my real thought was, I was like, this scene of the women setting fire to things at Stonewall, that's the perfect place to start. And then I was like, can I start 2 books in a row with the Stonewall riots? Is that just, no, I think that's wrong. I have to move away from that.
Oh, he's doing his gay touchstone again. Yeah, that's Now, what you had one point in there about this great treasure trove that you discovered, the New York Post publisher's study on the swastika swishery, 150-page thing, which, as near as you could tell, no one had ever read or reported on previously. Were there other things that you were coming across that were like, geez, I can't believe nobody's cited this yet, but...
There were a few, and some I didn't even know
and
swastika
myself. Swishery is a great name, by the way.
Swastika swishery, and an amazing story because it's all made up, and such a scandal to be based on nothing.
Yeah.
But there were some things, and often I did not know myself because I was learning so much that it was all that important. So there's a guy that I follow in the story, a sailor and inventor named Bill Miller, who was known as the most beautiful man in Manhattan in the 1940s. And he's a fascinating figure in many ways. He invents a chair, which is in the permanent collection at MoMA. In fact, it's on display right now. I just went and saw it. He works in the U.S. Army. He has affairs with like everyone. For a while, he's a kept boy traveling the world, and he's also one of Alfred Kinsey's informants, and he's sending these letters to Kinsey about his whole life and everything he's done sexually and pictures. So in his archive at Yale, I was going through some of his papers, and first I found a letter from Kinsey that was like, hey, so in the future, if you could just send all your letters to my office because my wife opened your last one, the one about you putting on a live sex show. Anyway, it didn't go over so well. So if you could just never do that again, like just never, ever, ever. There was definitely some insinuation that Bill Miller and Kinsey may have slept together themselves, although I couldn't prove it, so I didn't leave it in the book, but it certainly seems that way. And when I went to the Kinsey Institute, they said to me, we have no files on Bill Miller. Nothing. You know, and I had seen the other half of the letters. I knew for years Bill Miller and Alfred Kinsey were in close contact, that Bill Miller had gone there repeatedly, had sent him pornography that he had made, stuff he'd collected from around the world, reams of material. And it was just gone. Gone. Mm-hmm. There's no real understanding of what happened. One of the things that was suggested to me by talking to some other researchers is that the people who came immediately out after Kinsey were so worried about the way that he had conducted himself because his work was so groundbreaking in many ways. They were worried they were going to get in trouble and shut down or destroyed, and so that they may have proactively hidden or destroyed records that they thought were going to look badly on them. So Bill Miller, first off, just that he was in connection with all of this, that was a real find that I didn't know and that the Kinsey Institute did not know about. What was even more interesting was after World War II, he used the GI Bill. He made it through the war without ever, his sexuality being an issue, even though he was very open about it. And he went to Dartmouth. And at Dartmouth, he had a brief and incredibly intense affair with one of his professors, a man named Buckminster Fuller. So I reported on that, didn't think anything about it. In my head, I think I thought at most, I didn't realize Buckminster Fuller was queer. I didn't realize that nobody
had thought that either.
Yeah, there was maybe some whispers out there, but the day the book came out, literally the day, a guy working on a biography of Fuller reached out to me and was like, what is this information? Where did you get it? What is this? And I was like, I guess that's something that
broken new
matters.
ground.
Yeah.
Figure.
Yeah. So it was some really interesting moments like that. Often small things. I don't know if this is true because again, I don't know enough about it, but Hart Crane. I wrote a lot about Hart Crane. I discovered that he lived in the same building as the guy, Washington Roebling and Emily Roebling, the couple that finished building the Brooklyn Bridge. And I thought, well, that's an interesting coincidence. How did that happen? And so I did this research, and eventually I discovered that those buildings were all bought and put together into an artist colony by a man named Hamilton Easter Field, and that art colony is probably the reason that Hart Crane ended up living there. But by the time he was living there, Hamilton Easter Field was dead. And a guy who writes about Hart Crane reached out to me and said, I've never seen anything mention Hamilton Easter Field or the fact that was an art commune. And I was like, I don't know. It's just what I found.
I just assumed everybody knew this.
Yeah, there were a number of places like that where I was like, look, I'm very ignorant about a lot of things, so I just didn't know it mattered that much.
Yeah, what do you feel you got better at over the course of this?
Oh, God. Doubting myself.
Yeah. Is it that learning to ask that question? Is
yes.
it the
learning to say, is this important? Is this what I think it is? Mm-hmm. Am I seeing what I think I'm seeing, or am I making guesses and assumptions that I don't even realize that I'm making? Where are those moments where I've made an assumption and I need to dig deeper? The real thing that I think I learned in this, though, was how to write historically based work. I mean, I've always done this as a journalist to try to get ideas across to a broad readership. But even more so in doing this, I think because so much of the history that I read is academic, I can tend towards really long block quotes that need to get broken up and sort of tearing apart what I'm doing. Even up to about a month before the text was locked, I pulled out the second chapter and had to rewrite the entire thing because it just felt too alienating to the reader. I was like, this needs to somehow draw people in more. I need to make more space. And I would ask myself questions all the time, like, is that proper name necessary? Can I avoid using that proper name because it's just one more thing people have to remember, you know? Am I giving enough signposting? Have I referenced what year we're in enough times now that we're halfway through the chapter? Yeah. Those little things about the actual like business of writing history in a way that is readable were what I had to learn over and over again.
And balancing pronouns, gender pronouns.
Oh, yeah. That, it was fun. I actually liked having to do that because it meant taking on an exercise that you don't often do, which is looking at a historical figure and asking yourself, what are they telling me, right? So there are two historical figures in there for whom all of my research used one set of gendered pronouns. But as I looked at them, I was like, these are people who consistently are saying, this is my gender. Please recognize it. I would like to be called these things. And I was like, well, why don't we just listen to them? It's my book. I get to do whatever I want, and everyone else makes one decision. I get to make the decision I want to make. And so that was marvelously freeing because I found myself at first writing it using the pronouns that other researchers had used or that contemporary reports about them had used and feeling really uncomfortable about it and wondering how I was going to handle it. And then I was like, wait, I don't have to feel uncomfortable about this. I can do what I want. And then I'll just explain in the text the choices that I've made so that people can then decide for themselves how they feel about it. But at least they know what I'm thinking about when I make those choices.
And the evolution of queerness?
Difficult.
Well, there's this historical evolution of queerness, and then how it impacts you in terms of who you are as a writer and as a person.
I mean, I think that, obviously it impacts me because of my topic, but also in the way that I express myself. I was saying this to someone the other day. When thinking about how to write this book, I tried to write in a voice that was accessible to everyone who had an interest in this, but I often will try to use flavor text or textual details, like little things, asides, jokes that don't necessarily matter to the main part of the text and will not alienate a reader, but are much more embedded in a queer world. I was talking about how in an essay that I wrote a few years ago, I compared something to the smell of poppers at an orgy. And I recognize that that is not a metaphor that perhaps most people are going to have embodied experience with. But I don't mind using it as a small sort of toss-off gesture to express who I am in a larger essay that I feel is bringing people in and many, many people can read. So I sort of express my queerness. I want it to be visible, but I don't want it to block understanding. So I don't necessarily want to use it maybe as a dominant metaphor.
And certainly in the book, you don't put yourself in the forefront of anything. It's a historical text. It's only in the afterword where you talk about your own story in relation to it.
Yeah, my MFA was in creative nonfiction. I wrote memoir the whole time, personal essays. And I got to graduation and I was like, oh my God, I hate doing this. And it took 2 years of doing it to realize that. I thought that's what I wanted to do. And then I was like, I don't want to write about myself at all. I have no interest in people reading about me.
And that's why I wonder sort of about the collapse of history in the present, because everything is documented constantly and we have to try to figure out what actually matters.
It's true. But I will say that, I hear about the collapse of history and that, where there are fewer history majors, particularly at non-elite schools, and the university being turned into a factory model about return on investment. And that terrifies the fuck out of me. But in my personal life, I have to say that the interest in history, particularly queer history, feels like it has never been higher. Mm-hmm. I go to so many things in the last few years that call themselves archives or are about the historical this, and some of that history is, bad, of course, obviously. Some of it is fantastic. Much of it is unknown to me. And I think there's a real democratization that is happening right now with history and with museums. I think that you are seeing more attempts to reach broader audiences and different audiences that I love, and that there is a level of what you can do using your computer, the number of newspaper archives you can search through, the oral histories you can listen to, the access you can have, even if you aren't able to get into these big institutions, if they aren't near you or you're not a student, is pretty phenomenal. And I am really excited about that. I get really mad when I read bad queer history, it just makes me shake my fist and I want to write angry comments, and then I realize there's no reason to do that because no one cares. But just the fact that there is such an interest in it is exciting in a way, there was nothing like that when I was growing up. So
I should ask, although you can tell me whether it's off limits or not, your process of coming out?
Haphazard.
Yeah.
I came out while I was in high school, to my parents, not, and to my friends too, somewhat, but it was very limited. It wasn't that kind of like super public coming out. I was in a small public school. I'd been with the same 60 students since kindergarten, in a not conservative town. We were outside of New York City, but we were definitely a suburb. There were not any out gay people. It was rocky. My family is loving, wonderful people, and we're super close now, but we had some rocky years. It was the 90s. Everything was AIDS. I feel like when I came out, like that was definitely the foremost thought in my head. And then I went off to college, and I went to a very, very large school. I went to Cornell, and part of the reason was because I wanted just more. I felt like I'd lived such a small life, and I wanted to see so much more and meet people, and particularly other queer people. And it was there that that's how I ended up in women's studies, and I joined every queer group on campus. And I think for me, it was a very political coming out process. I was really interested in organizing, in studying, and doing a lot of events and stuff like that. So that's kind of where my own coming out, I think, really happened, was somewhere between reading Michel Foucault and becoming involved with the Feminist Action League on campus. That was my coming out process. And then when I moved to New York, I worked, my first job in the city was working with homeless and transitionally housed LGBT youth at the Harvey Milk School. And that was really fantastic and introduced me to a whole different sort of queer population. So it's a kind of a never-ending process. I've been professionally gay for a really long time now.
And do you ever think of leaving New York?
Every day.
Yeah.
I love New York. I love it. I grew up thinking there was nowhere else I would ever live. My parents are from the Bronx, and we didn't move very far. And it just felt like, of course, I was going to end up in New York. And I would say every 6 months, I think, should I move? I've moved a couple times. I moved to Berlin for 6 months, then I came back, and I moved to Puerto Rico twice and came back, and I moved to New Orleans. I moved to North Carolina. Nothing sticks.
I was going to say, New Orleans, you might get something, but also if you're used to having seasons.
Yeah, New Orleans, I made it until July, and then I was like, no, this is being in hell.
Yeah.
Also, so most of my life straight edge. I had never drank alcohol. I'd never done any drugs. And New Orleans was the place where I revisited those decisions and sort of experimented with other things. And after about 6 months, my liver was like, only one of us is making it out of here. So
my first semester of college was too late, and I didn't drink back then. I don't drink now either, but in between, I made up for it. But that first semester, I was like, this is not the place to live. And it wasn't a AA thing. It was me being a drama queen. But at the same time, I was like, this is not going to work. So I ended up going to the acid capital of the country at a time that I didn't do any drugs either. So I was always
that Berkeley or
Hampshire.
Hampshire. Oh yeah. Okay.
Again, when we talk about non-major universities and colleges going under, mine is currently struggling to find money to keep going for another year.
I will say I love all the institutions I worked with were wonderful and incredible and opened their doors to me in amazing ways. But you could see the effects of a lack of funding on these places, the queer archives, but also the non-queer archives. There was one place that I went to, that swastika swishery story. I found photos.
Always funny.
There were very few, but there were a couple photos from the raid on the brothel that night. I saw them when I was doing my research. Looked at the actual photos. It was great. I was like, this is so exciting to see them in person. Mug shots of the owner of the brothel. A few years later, went back to look for them to get permissions to put them in the book, and they were gone. And the people said, we don't know. They were in that folder, and now that folder is empty. And that happened not infrequently. Yeah. Just things disappear. They go away, and it's shocking. But it also helped me to understand, the first couple times you go to archives, I don't know if you've had this experience, but the first couple times I was like, these assholes are so uptight about everything.
White gloves, why do I have to? Yeah.
And now I'm like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Please. No, you're right that I shouldn't touch it. How about I levitate above the document while you slowly, using a gust of air, turn the pages?
Giant magnifying glass so I can look at everything without coming anywhere near it. So. It's got to be rough. Any talk of documentary type stuff we've been hearing from?
We have. I actually, it's funny. I picture it not as a documentary, but as a 5-season Netflix series.
Sure.
I think Deadwood and Gentleman Jack, and I want like the lush produced version of it. And we have some interest. For a little while there, we had a couple of writers who were really wonderful, who were actually very interested in it, and they helped me think through a lot of how to translate this into television. They then got another show, which, fabulous for them. I'm very happy. I was a little sad. So the rights have not yet been purchased, but I'm definitely hoping that there will be some kind of TV film adaptation.
And who do you cast as Hart Crane?
Oh my God, I don't.
Well, I was going to go with Auden for my other one, but yeah.
That's really hard because my instinct is to go with someone that I want to sleep with because that's how I feel about Hart Crane. And now that I've said that out loud, I feel I can't I name any actors or my partners will be mad. But I think I could see a Eddie Redmayne. He's not exactly the physical type, but I would still be happy with that as Hart Crane. However, I'm like the least visual person on earth. Like my partners are always like, I'll be like, that actor looks like that person. They'll be like, no, they look
my wife
nothing.
does the same thing for me. She corrects my complete inability to identify anyone by name or face. It's just that guy who was in that thing. That's pretty. Did we see him before? Then she
endlessly. I'll also with colors. I'll be like that blue jacket, and they're like the green jacket. The green. You mean the green? And I'm like, oh, it's close enough.
Yeah. Anyway, Hugh, I look forward to seeing the TV show. We'll keep our fingers crossed. And thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. This is really fun, Gil. You do a great podcast, so it was my pleasure.
Thanks. And that was Hugh Ryan. His new book is When Brooklyn Was Queer from St. Martin's Press. It is a really entertaining, informative history. It'll definitely change your perceptions of New York and the inextricable ties of queer life in the city and the economics and the ways that development changes these communities. When Brooklyn Was Queer, it's available wherever you buy books, and it's Pride Month, so go get it. Now, you can visit Hugh's site, HughRyan.org, to learn more about his work. And that's spelled just like it sounds, HughRyan.org. He's on Twitter at Hugh_Ryan, and he's got a Patreon you can donate to and support his work at patreon.com/Hugh Ryan, all one word. And after we wrapped, I asked Hugh, so, who are you reading? And if you want to hear his answer to that, and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The first quarter 2019 episode features book recommendations and extra conversation with Jerome Charan, Peter Cooper, Edmund White, Eva Hagberg, Mort Gerberg, James Osland, Joe Chardello, James Sturm, Martin Haglund, Brian Presser, and Nathan Englander. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, which I've kind of let fall by the wayside once again, but I am 4 weeks ahead on the show, so maybe I'll have time to work on it, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. I recorded this one 2 weeks ago at Hugh's office in Lower Manhattan. It was the second show of the day. The first one was in Brooklyn with Stephen Guarnaccia, and I found street parking outside Stephen's place, so it was just the GWB toll to get there, plus $6 for the subway to Lower Manhattan, and the Triborough toll to get home. It all piles up. So if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Buzz Sawyer, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Now, our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and listen to his music at soundcloud.com/May4th. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with a return visit from Bill Griffith, the cartoonist behind Zippy the Pinhead and the author of the amazing and wonderful new biography, Nobody's Fool, The Life and Times of Schlitzie the Pinhead. As you can tell, there is a pinhead through line to Bill's work. Now, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.